Thank you. I'm Kathryn Waddington. When we prepared this presentation, I was head of psychology. From the 1st of January, I've reverted to my research role as reader, having done my 3 years as head of psychology. And essentially, we just want to share with you some of our experience of our successful institutional Athena Swan Award. Westminster was the first university to get an award, a bronze award, using the extended criteria. So for the first time today, we're going to use the term intersectionality, because that's something that we haven't really addressed. So we're going to have an intersectional focus with regard to that. I'm coming at this from the point of view of an intersectional academic identity. I mentioned earlier, I come from a background of nursing and healthcare, and I'm also a work and organisational psychologist. What I want to share with you, this is what I've brought with me from my healthcare practice. And some of you may be familiar with this Cherokee proverb. I'll just like to read it out to you in a slightly abridged form. So this is a Cherokee proverb with a grandfather talking to his grandchildren. And he said to them, "A fight is going on inside me. It's a terrible fight, and it's between two wolves. One wolf represents fear, anger, envy, greed, arrogance, superiority, and ego. The other wolf stands for joy, peace, hope, sharing, kindness, generosity, and compassion. And that same fight is going on inside all of you and inside every other person too." They thought about it for a minute, and then one grandchild asked, "Which wolf will win?" And the old Cherokee simply replied, "The one you feed." Now, I think that's really important for all of us to think about, and as a work and organisational psychologist, and the research tells us, these emotions get played out in our organisational cultures, in our organisational systems, in our organisational dynamics. And with regard to the question this morning, how do you change culture? I think by, rather than feeding the wolf of compassion, nurturing compassion in small acts in our organisations is one way of changing the culture. So we're going to come at this from multiple perspectives. And so, are there any other psychologists or psychology-related people in the room? Good to see a few hands. So this is our professional body's perspective. The British Psychological Society, which is responsible for the promotion of psychology as a science and practical applications of the discipline, has recently published its commitment and declaration to equality, diversity and inclusion. And you can find out more information here. We're going to just give you the headlines for our presentation, so please look at the slides when they're made available. And I think it's really important for all of us to kind of walk the talk. So this is the BPS perspective. Student and early career researchers, and again, it's been difficult to get the colours changed, but predominantly women, 80% of women. When you look at an associate fellow, this is in the society, but often associated with academic roles, the women beginning to kind of drip out. When you look at the fellows, and when you look at the presidents have been predominantly men and, less so women. And I think it's really important that we begin to tackle these issues at every level. Thinking about our university application, we couldn't have done that without collaborating with colleagues in professional services. So I'd just like to acknowledge the work of somebody called Elizabeth Baptiste, who couldn't be here today, who works in our HR department in leadership development. It's really important that we all work together. And this is a model, I'll just really highlight the really important things, which are to do with thinking about the bit in the middle as the person. What we know about the neuroscience of change and threat is how people behave when they feel under threat, particularly with regard to status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness and fairness. Around the middle circle, these are the concepts from interprofessional practice, what we need to have from my world of healthcare and interprofessional working. We need to be aware of the power discrepancies. We need to aware how we work in partnership, the interdependence of everything that we do, and we need to share. And the bit around the outside is the process, the way in which we do it. And I just really want to kind of focus on one of these in particular, which is about feeling comfortable to challenge our assumptions and challenge our values and our way of thinking. And that has to go at every single level, upwards, downwards, horizontally, at all areas of the institution. And without that collaborative working and actually having the courageous and difficult conversations, then we're not going to go anywhere. Thinking about our institution, coming to an institutional level now, These were the areas that we put into our action plan with regard to recognising and supporting intersectionality, which is Deborah's going to talk about a little bit more in her part of the presentation. So really it's about education, it's about awareness, it's about training and related actions, which is where we had to work really closely and continue to work closely with colleagues in other parts of the university. It's about supporting trans people, trans staff and students. And it's also, from our students' point of view, thinking about the black and minority ethnic student attainment gap. Moving to a faculty level, we are a Department of Psychology in a Faculty of Science and Technology. We were previously in a School of Social Sciences and Humanities. And one of the strengths of psychology as a discipline is its inclusivity and diversity. And so the BPS have actually coined the term of psychology as a STEM plus discipline, because not only do we have cognitive and clinical neuroscience, we've got critical psychology, we've got group psychology, we've got feminist psychology, things that really help us understand the multiplicity and intersectionality. But it's not always easy, being what's seen as stereotypes. Psychology as a bit of a soft science has been a bit pink and fluffy. A colleague said to me within about the last 6 weeks, who works in a senior position, not an academic position, as part of an action learning set that I'm in, and he said, "Oh, Kathryn, are you a proper scientist?" Because there's that kind of stereotype of psychology as a discipline being a bit pink and fluffy, or the stereotype there in relation to kind of people still say to me, "Oh, what do you do?" "I'm a psychologist." "Oh, I better watch what I say." "Oh, you're going to be analysing me," which kind of counters some of the other kind of traditional images of psychology as a discipline. And actually this paper down here, Psychology is a Science within Comte's Hypothesized Hierarchy, we don't have penis envy, we have physics envy. So before I hand over to Debbie, for those of you at the back that may not be able to see, this is maybe, rather than a hierarchy, I would say more of a continuum. So over here we've got sociologists, but psychologists say, they say psychology is just applied, sociology is applied psychology. The neuroscientists say, no, psychology is just applied biology. And the biologists say, no, biology is just applied chemistry, and which is just applies physics, which is nice to be on top. And over here, hello, it's the mathematicians. But these things too do get played out. And rather than a hierarchy, I just like to say it's a continuum. We have to break down some of these stereotypes. And thinking about, this is our department, which is a fantastic department, and it's really important that not only do we, in terms of our physical space, embody transparency, but we also need to think about gender balance. So this is a little bit, this could be any psychology department in the country, and indeed nationally, but you can see that when you look at people coming in at the kind of front end of the pipeline, there's a lot more women than men, and then you get this kind of crossover point, and then you get, obviously we're talking about small numbers when it comes to readers and professors, but we've got a big gap, and there's a lot that we need to do to fill that gap. So over to Deborah.
Okay, so how many of you here are teaching academics? Okay. How many of you have daily interaction with black female students? The numbers dwindle. Okay. How many of you are carrying out research on black female students? Good. That makes me niche. Fantastic. Right, so that's exactly what my research is all about. We're bringing it right down to the local context now. So you've had a lot of high-level strategies spoken of today. You've seen a lot of high-level data. But I want to bring this thing down right to the kind of the coalface, if you like, the local context. So my research is looking at the experiences of a niche group in higher education, undergraduate black female students. And I take a reflexive researcher's perspective to this, simply because I myself am a black female student. I'm not quite a doctor yet, but thank you for that. My PhD will be completed next year. Just to give you a little bit of background in BME studies, Black and minority ethnicity studies. So in the US, and I know there are people here from the US, it's been a long-standing area of research. We know quite a lot about the experiences of this group, less so in the UK, where it is developing. And in the US, rightly so, there's been a prominent focus on deconstructing some of these deficit perspectives that have been given as accounts for student performance, for Black BME student performance. In the UK, the focus has been much more quantitative, so it's about tracking students across the pipeline, although we recognize that there is something called the attainment gap for BME students. The research shows us then that there are certain groups that are ignored in research, and Elizabeth Cole, a prominent intersectionality researcher, tells us that Black female students is just one of those groups. And so while we have this growing body of qualitative research in the UK, it tends to look at BME student experiences across the board. And so my research is addressing this gap in the research by looking at these students as a specific context of student diversity. So currently in the UK, we have this issue of the attainment gap I alluded to. And if you look at the red column, we can see that year on year, there is an increase in the numbers of students that are being awarded what we call a good degree, a first or a 2-1 degree. So for Black students, you can see that number through to 2011-12, but it's not commensurate with their counterparts. There is a differential awarding going on, and by 2015, there was a 26.3% gap in the awarding between white and Black students. Now this has a way of feeding into the experience that these students have of university, and suggests that they may be poorly integrated, not necessarily their fault, and that there are specific challenges for these students that need to be addressed. And more researchers are starting to look at that. So I said something about deficit perspectives. And the problem with these perspectives, of course, is that they situate the problem as being within the student, intrinsic to the student, rather than looking at the external structures. They also underemphasize the capital that these students are bringing into their academic environments. It's rich. There are a lot of rich life experiences that they bring into university, and this needs to be recognized. Instead, the tendency is to overemphasize things like confidence. They lack confidence. I strongly refute this. These are the same students that are applying to Oxbridge, that's Oxford and Cambridge. They're applying to elite institutions. And in many cases they're getting in, but there are still some issues in terms of the numbers there. These perspectives also ignore the fact that these students are having to embrace a Eurocentrically influenced curricula. There are issues about that when you look at material and you don't see yourself reflected, where you don't see international scholarship as part of your curriculum. And this has fueled some protest movements in the UK, some of which you may be familiar with. Why is my curriculum white? So this asks specifically the question about a Eurocentric curriculum. Coming out of a philosophy sort of background, where the emphasis there was on why are we learning from these dead white men? But it's now taken on a life of its own, and it's being looked at across a number of disciplines. Why isn't my professor Black is another movement. So the issue there is, in terms of Black staff, there are probably around 6 to 8% Black staff in UK academia. So that's a really small number. I say Black, not BME, because of course the number is bigger when we bring in the BME aspect. So I'm taking an intersectionality approach to looking at these students' experiences. How many of you are familiar with the term intersectionality? Good, so it's gaining some parlance here. Right, so with intersectionality, a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, it recognizes that we are not just one thing. There are multiple aspects to who we are. We have multiple identities. And for some groups, there is a multiplied burden. So you're not just dealing with gender, you're dealing with gender, ethnicity, disability, gender, ethnicity, disability, sexual orientation, and so on and so forth. And I like to use this kind of analogy to represent intersectionality. And what we see here is these points, these intersecting points, where if we think of the main highway with the kind of normative constructions, those binary constructions, male, female, white, black, and then we have people with other social locations trying to join that freeway, the points of intersection represent confusion, hurt, and pain. So how is that experienced? Kimberly Crenshaw even said, can we get to a full structural critique of identity when we're all so many different things, and importantly, all at the same time? So my research takes a triangulated account of identity construction. I think that's important because I'm dealing with multiple identities. And I'm looking at a central phenomenon from 3 different analytic vantage points. I'm going to briefly share some of the findings. I could speak on this forever, but I'm going to try and be concise. So the non-traditional students in my research, and these are the students that are over the age of, say, 22, 23, coming in with non-normative qualifications, expressed the construction of their identity through a dual lens of maturity and ethnicity. There was also a hierarchical constraint for the way in which they presented identity. So for them, to belong was the most important thing, sometimes at the expense of some of these other selves. And I refer to these as hungry babies and trying to decide which baby do I feed first. But for these students, to belong is the most important thing. I'm going to skip through these, but just to say that the things that are coming out, the critical points, is that there are points of attrition for these students that we need to be aware of. By second year, mature students are dropping out. They feel excluded simply because of being mature. There's a stigma attached to that. It seems as if there is a landscape of unbelonging that's punctuated with small pockets of belonging, but it's not sustained. And this student talks about an experience where she felt she was being rendered invisible because one of the lecturers persistently ignored them. So we have these kinds of stories. Traditional students, these are the ones coming in at normative ages between 18 and 21, don't present with a kind of central construct. They're more shifting cells, transitioning from one thing to the other. Now, similar things were being said in terms of unbelonging, but I just want to hang on this point. This particular student told me the story about when she came in. Her personal tutor in the first year said to her, you need to be aware that students like you don't get firsts, so don't get your hopes up. She then fed into that stereotype, and her comment was, I'd rather feel inadequate because I wasn't doing really well than to be made to feel inadequate because I'm doing average. And it took me a while to unpack that until I came across a quote attributed to Michelangelo. The greater danger for most of us lies in not setting our aim too high and falling short, but in setting our aim too low and achieving our mark. And that's exactly what she did. She had an academic ceiling, and that was imposed from year 1. I'll summarize. So, their identity is formed from a number of different areas, from life histories through to future aspirations. Sense of belonging is the biggest indicator for these students, less so for traditional students. But what I'm finding is that there are some shared characteristics with other groups of students, from first years through to poorly supported white students. And that needs further investigation to see if there's some kind of correlation going on here. There's a psychological cost to maintaining these multiple cells, and the traditional students tend to downplay the essence of who they are. So they'll deny culture, they'll deny all those things that are important parts of their capital to feel as if they belong, to feel as if they're part of the mainstream, the normative groups. Particularly for the non-traditional students, there was a sense of being penalized because of their ethnicity. So what does that mean for higher education institutions in terms of actions? Well, I interviewed students across 5 London institutions, and they were all saying the same thing. So this suggests that there are some systemic challenges that need to be addressed through the policies and the practices that we currently have in higher education. We need to learn from student satisfaction, review our academic environments, and engage with the kind of scholarship that informs us about the experiences of these marginalised groups. In terms of the student experience, a diverse curricula is important. It needs to be sensitively applied. They want role models. They want to see people that look like them. And of course, that would then help them to cope with things such as stereotype threat. Targeted interventions, mentoring is good, but it must be sensitively applied. It must be, otherwise students will construe that as tokenistic, and that has been the case with some students who are resistant to go forward for mentoring. Personally, I had access to two things. I call them the two H's: strategic help seeking and the hidden curriculum. I couldn't have done it on my own. I needed support to be able to access those two things, to be here today talking to you. My sponsor is the one who's made it possible for me to be here financially. This isn't something I could have afforded to do. But I also needed two other things. I needed a broker and a mentor. Once you get into an environment like this, your broker helps you to know how to open doors. Students need this kind of support. Once you open the doors, you need to know how to network. My mentor and my broker is Kathryn Waddington, and I'm really pleased that she's here to support me. But all of this that's been said and done, if there's no compassion, then it's just a tick box exercise.
Okay, so just to conclude with a shameless bit of self-publicity, but it is really important. There's a book coming out very shortly called The Pedagogy of Compassion at the Heart of Higher Education, and I'm just one of many authors. And this is what I think, if we're thinking about changing the culture, this is what we need to do. We need to be open-minded and self-aware individually. We need to understand the science and the neuroscience of mindful compassion. We need to expose and illuminate the dark side of university life, the horrible, uncompassionate ego side. Think about insights and concepts from psychodynamic psychology, which will help us do that, and then work together to shift cultural patterns and behaviours at all levels. And just very quick bit of insight as I've been thinking about, the authors of the book, we're trying to do a big international study around compassion, looking at interdisciplinary, cross-cultural perspectives, and why is compassion oozing out of our institutions. And maybe it's because we've got, don't like the metaphor, but the leaky pipeline, maybe the compassion's leaking out at the same time as the women. So just to bring it to a close, these are some of the people that we've been collaborating with. And we'd just like to say thank you very much for listening to us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Waddington, and soon to be Dr. Husbands. We definitely have time for questions, so do we have any questions? Yes, we do, at the back.
Julia Rouse from the Sylvia Pankhurst Centre at Manchester Metropolitan University. Thanks, I thought that was really engaging, and you're incredibly confident, so that's great. I suppose I'm wondering, from my point of view, is it compassion or is it political engagement, political commitment and activism? And also from my own practice, I think developing, in my case, a feminist research community, slowly but surely creates this space where people can access all these things. And where the potential cost of spending your time on these things, which is not rewarded by the promotion committee, I have to tell you, pays back because you start to be able to do more research because you're developing that research around you, but without it being exploitative, you know. So it's this sort of long game, but I like the word, I'm intrigued by the word compassion, but for me it feels more like I'm worried that some sort of idea of detriment underlies compassion, and therefore political activist engagement feels a bit more comfortable, but I'm not sure. I'm genuinely curious.
I think there's probably, what you're talking about there is maybe kind of two sides of the same coin, but looking at it from a slightly different perspective. And certainly there's some of the people I'm beginning to collaborate with around compassion. And if you think about what's happening globally, refugee crisis, I don't want to mention the man whose name begins with T, but I won't. But if you think about what's going on around us globally, and for me, coming towards the end of my academic career, and I look at colleagues that are coming in, I think that we do need to have a kind of strong compassion in order to make some changes. So I think kind of working together on that is one of the ways of doing it, and learning from experience of people like yourselves.
Okay, and we have a question at the front.
Hello, my name is Charlotte. I'm from Lund University. I'm just wondering, I'm really afraid of stereotype threat. And I'm just thinking, is there, have they done research on training in unconscious bias to see if it only plays out positively or if it has any negative impact?
Do you want to answer that one?
Well, in terms of conscious bias, I've got a big bias against unconscious bias. I think it's early days to say how effective it is as an intervention, if you want to call it that. I do have an issue about institutions rolling it out as a one-hit wonder and expecting that that's going to change years of implicit attitudes. We're talking about years of social categorization. Stereotyping begins from the age of 2. So I'm not sure how an online 2-hour course is going to make a difference. I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done around that. It's a start, but it should only be seen as that.
But you don't think it could make it worse?
Not necessarily, because I think it's challenging things that we really need to be having conversations about. So, yeah, it's a start. There's more to be done.
And just to add to that, it's a start, and it's a start of important awareness raising. And I saw something quite recently in an HR practitioner magazine that Tinu co-authored, saying exactly that. There also needs to be other things that need to be put in place. And the example that was given in that piece was that certainly some of the, I think, MBA programs in business schools are now actually lowering to a 2-2 as their threshold grade because of the acknowledgement of the BME student attainment gap. So there's other structural things that need to change as well.
It will be the last question there.
Joyce Wong, Boston University. So I may have missed this because I was in the other sessions. I don't know if you covered it in the first part of the talk. I saw from when Deborah started, but I'm wondering if, so I know from other researchers, for example, Juan Gilbert is at University of Florida, and he, I think is probably the one who's trained the most African-American computer scientist PhDs in the US. And and he says a lot of the things is to always recruit in twos at least, or in cohorts, so building community. So I didn't know if that's something is in your research as well, just making sure because in his case he was saying starting from 0, he had 2, became 4, became 8, and so I'm just wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, I think that's a really important one, the idea of community, because this is something that students specifically talked about, the sense of onlyness, being the only one, and how important it was to be able to see others that look like them, not just in terms of staff, but in terms of their peers. In the UK, we have an interesting picture when it comes to recruiting to certain disciplines. In psychology, one of the institutions that I went to, and this was an elite institution to interview students, there were only 3 black female students on this particular degree. So I think there's a real issue for building capacity, building communities, and recruiting in their strengths.
Super. Thank you very much. A round of applause for our speakers, please.